After receiving critical and commercial success, it was expanded upon in 2022 with the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, a reimagining of the game for consoles and home computers.
Understanding the Stanley Parable requires, to an extent, understanding its lead writer, Davey Wreden. We can't come to know Davey through his game, because the game is a work of fiction, and even though he injects a lot of personality into the game, we don't really have a meaningful way of assessing how much of that personality can be a reflection of Davey's life outside of the game. But evaluating the Stanley Parable as a text requires understanding it as, in part, a piece authored by Wreden. It's a highly postmodern game, and one element of its postmodern perspective is to incorporate the author into the text. This would be even more true of his follow-up game, The Beginner's Guide, which cast Wreden as himself directly narrating to the player throughout the course of the game. I don't think a game as emotionally complex as The Beginner's Guide can be made without some personal experience that motivates it. This doesn't mean Davey's personal experiences can be discerned through the text, or that the text is representative of any specific experience. But the emotions of the game definitely reflect an honesty that requires a nuanced understanding of what it feels like to have serious depression, anxiety, and interpersonal struggles. I've been through that myself, and while viewers of this video don't know me through my videos necessarily, I try to be honest and see-through about some of these experiences I've had, so that people can see personal investment and empathy are actually really valuable in understanding a work of art. For me, the best art is art that helps me understand myself. I grew to love The Beginner's Guide because it helped me understand myself, and not because it helped me understand Davey Wreden. Davey wrote about depression and how the Stanley Parable's acclaim fed into feelings of imposter syndrome in a since-deleted blog post, which I feel is relevant, but also not something to focus on given its deletion. It goes without saying that in this video, I've been preoccupied with reading the Stanley Parable through the lens of how it comments on neoliberalism. This is because neoliberalism is the dominant cultural force in our current era. It impacts all of our lives, and it impacts all art that has existed during the neoliberal era of global politics and economics. The reason why I view the Stanley Parable so thoroughly through this lens is not because I think the meta stuff is irrelevant, but because I believe that meta themes in art tend to be meaningless without some external logic that makes them worthwhile. Commenting on games or movies or on your own work is pointless if the only purpose is to point to itself. The point of meta themes are to call attention to serious problems in the medium. Postmodern art wants you to be skeptical of these problems so that you will find ugly truths that these problems seek to obscure. The Stanley Parable comments pretty thoroughly on games, not just as an experience for the player, but as an industry, as a business. And games as a business are caught up in the tech industry, which is one of the most neoliberal industries there is. The depression that Davey experienced with the Stanley Parable, that kind of imposter syndrome and desire to have his game be beloved, is tied up in how neoliberalism operates. Neoliberalism devalues the individual human and replaces their psychological makeup with the psychological makeup of micro-capitalists. In other words, you are only as good as your dollar value, and so you must convert all aspects of your life into dollar value in order to matter. Now, video games are not always about making money. Certainly, a lot of free games exist that are made simply for the love of the game. But most people who make art want to make money so that they can survive doing what they love. The problem with doing this is that it turns art into a commodity, into a means of generating money. And once art becomes a commodity, you can't just make art. You have to continually, endlessly make art in order to survive, or if you've done well and have fully internalized the neoliberal project, in order to make more and more money. The result is that art for its own sake becomes secondary to art that will resonate and make people want to buy it. You stop making the music that sounds good to you and start making the music that you think will sound good to the most people. And then somewhere along that path, you forget what it was like to enjoy music. Music becomes work, it becomes labor. That same thing can happen with video games, and given the intense amount of labor that goes into making almost any game, this means that games become product. And while I think Davey Wreden injects a lot of personality and passion into the games he makes, I'm sure getting to make a living off of video game design was at least one motive behind wanting the Stanley Parable to do well. And whether or not he knows it, that could very well be a reason why he developed an addictive, depressive relationship to his own game. This same point is made by The Beginner's Guide. In The Beginner's Guide, Davey views the works of the fictional Coda with a lot of passion and love. He sees that Coda is a true creative, someone content to make video games just to make them. But Coda does not seek to release them, to monetize them. The Beginner's Guide is presented to the player as a monetized form of games that Coda made just for himself. Coda has a freedom from the culture of commodifying all aspects of your life through his games that Davey, in the game, doesn't understand or appreciate. By turning them into something to be displayed, to be presented for approval, he has bastardized what was, for Coda, a very personal endeavor. This is what often happens with games, or with any form of art. The second you give it up to the crowd, it ceases to be yours. It ceases to be yours creatively, emotionally, and also spiritually. It becomes product. It becomes a thing to sell. And I hope Davey succeeded with both games. I hope they made a profit and that Davey can live more comfortably off of the success of his work. I also hope that regardless of what his actual life is like, that he's doing well and that what depression can be seen in his blog post or in the beginner's guide is not a reflection of where he's at in his life. But here's the point I want to get at. If Davey Wreden in the beginner's guide is a self-insert, I kind of get the impression that Stanley is too. But hear me out, this will take a while. The Stanley Parable was originally a mod for Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 and its accompanying source engine is fairly limited in what it can render. It looks beautiful when playing Half-Life 2, but there are a lot of shortcuts that the engine takes that results in a lot of the images looking kind of flat and blocky. Given limited animation and modeling for humans, the Occam's razor principle of how to view the Stanley Parable's inspiration is to simply say that it takes place in an empty office because an empty office is remarkably easy to design in the source engine. Davey Wreden began work on the Stanley Parable right out of college. Did he have any white-collar jobs before the Stanley Parable? Probably not. And while the information that I can find on Wreden is scarce from a basic Google search, I found out that his degree was in critical studies and he did not have a strong technical background. So I may have done a lot of the same kinds of readings that I have about neoliberalism or tech industry and media industry issues. He probably didn't slave away at a desk job for long periods before making the game. However, the reason I see Stanley as a bit of a self-insert is because Stanley is confronting a sort of crushing indifference from the world around him with a combination of curiosity and fear. As someone who is about to graduate college myself with no clue what will happen in my career or life after, I could see any number of prospects, from the most grim to the most lavish. Will I end up stuck at a desk job forever? Will I become a respected artist? Will I feel that my work is rewarding and good? Will I even find work at all? These kinds of questions are open at this time of my life, and as someone who studies the impact of neoliberalism on people's lives pretty thoroughly, I feel a similar crushing indifference that my future holds. Interviews with Davey suggest that the decision to have a game be centered around the option to defy a narrative path that is dictated to the player was the central idea around which all of the story and various branching paths eventually emerged. He didn't start with a piece about the bleakness of the corporate world, but he did end up with one, whether or not that was intentional, though I have to imagine it would have been at least partially intentional, given how obviously bleak the corporate world of the game is. In interviews, Davey has mentioned as influences on his art the works of Brendan Chung and Charlie Kaufman. Kaufman uses surrealism to tell stories about existentialism in the face of crushing indifference from the world around you. Chung's two games that Davey notes, Gravity Bone and 30 Flights of Loving, use the tradition of a first-person shooter to tell stories that are unlike anything ever presented in the genre or in gaming in general. Davey, in an interview, singled out 30 Flights of Loving, stating, "The game cuts around in time regularly, chopping up chronology to create a fractured experience of relationships and action and love and loss. The game happens in beats, little memories tucked away inside one's memory, the way that we tend to process memories in real life. The game is honest. It says, look, this is just how we process traumatic events. We selectively edit and filter to get the narrative we want. It still amazes me that no one had ever done this before." This is interesting to me. See, in a past video I made about Lynch's Inland Empire, which I will eventually come back to and expand on, I made the point that the Rabbids miniseries chops up dialogue and presents it out of order within a surrealist sitcom framework. But when you piece the dialogue in the correct order, it seems to tell a story of lingering trauma after the experience of being raped. Severe trauma can sometimes fracture the mind, causing thoughts to come in strange ways that don't make sense to people who haven't been through it. I myself have been through some severe traumas throughout my life, and I can say that selectively editing and filtering is definitely a part of how it's experienced. But for me, the biggest experience of lingering trauma is just this feeling that a part of me stayed in that moment forever, and that sometimes I can't tell which part of me is the one still alive. Because sometimes it feels as if I never left, and that everything since those events have just been a delusion. That I'm always there, forever in that room, in that house, in that town. Trapped. As someone who specifically has struggled with agoraphobia, the experience of it is a double bind that is hellish. On the one hand, if I go out into the world, I risk new trauma, I risk new horrible experiences. On the other, if I stay in my comfort zone of my own home or what few places I feel safe, then my life slowly gets sucked away into nothing. Every day becomes defined by the objects only in immediate proximity. It's like I can never leave, at which point it's like I never lived at all. It feels almost comatose to spend too long exposed to isolation. When I play the Stanley Parable, I see the same isolation in the game that I experienced in my life, as though escape from the confines of where I've spent most of my life is an illusion. And I mean, don't worry, I handle most days fine and I'm in a very good place as of the time of writing this. I go out, I see people, I live my life. But one of my big fears is that as I go into the workforce after college, it will only create more of this sense of being strangled by my surroundings, of being trapped. Routines frighten me for this reason too, because eventually the things I can do to resist that feeling of being trapped will become not enough because they will be part of it. I don't think the Stanley Parable is autobiographical necessarily, but I do think that the character of Stanley reflects an anxiety that faces a lot of younger people as they enter into adulthood, which is the sense that once you leave the comfort of school and adolescence and have to start being a part of the neoliberal world in full, there becomes this sense that this is it. That you find your career, you slave away at it, and then you die. Your life means nothing, your death means nothing, and you mean nothing. The Stanley Parable is, in this sense, a game that confronts all of the absurdities of growing into a working adult and having to face the fact that in order to make ends meet and live comfortably in the contemporary world, you have to enter into a sort of endlessly binding series of corporate mazes with decisions the consequences of which are hard to predict. Anything could happen, but at the same time, everything sort of feels like nothing. And within that nothing is a sense of dread that once you enter into the maze, that's just what life is. The existential anxieties in the Stanley Parable reflect not just the role that work plays in people's lives, but the role that video games play in people's lives too. They often only substitute the meaningful connection and meaningful experiences that people lack in their lives as workers. They offer comfort, but that comfort is often hollow. And as I'll get to in the next section, they also often reproduce the conditions of labor in a way that turns the player into the worker. And if you want to use video games as a platform for artistry and storytelling, you eventually have to learn how to spend large amounts of time in front of the computer working away. Eventually your art becomes your desk job, and then eventually you're trapped, the same as Stanley, the same as everyone. The reason I read a bit of the author into the Stanley Parable is because the Stanley Parable is marked by a certain anxiety in the fact that it has so many branching paths that are all meaningless and all detrimental. That's exactly what it feels like to come out of college. You have so many places you can go, but all of them lead eventually to having to work, to live, to work, to live, to work, to live. The end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end. There is no escape from having to become a worker. There is no way to not eventually face the possibility of becoming a neoliberal object. It would be one thing to make a game with a series of infinitely branching paths and have some, most, or even all of them be positive outcomes for the player or main character. But to have them be trapped in a sort of purgatorial state where each outcome is just another slide down into hell does not reflect a positive outlook on work, on corporations, on gaming, or on life in general. Wreden does seem to love video games based on interviews, but presents video games as being viciously circular and to the detriment of the player. There is no way out of an oppressive system while agreeing to its terms and conditions.
Since I've completely forgotten what we were supposed to be doing, how about this? You win! Congratulations! I know you put in a lot of hard work and it really paid off, so good job.
Now let's talk meta. Yes, the game comments on games, but games are an industry greatly impacted by neoliberalism. I'll bring it up again and again as it becomes relevant in videos on my channel, but I read a great academic article arguing that video games are a fundamentally neoliberal medium, having came to prominence during the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s, and sharing a lot of the same values as neoliberalism. If one is to view games through the lens of neoliberal ideology, games position players to be micro-capitalists. In most games, there is some goal that is clearly stated or subtly implied, encouraging the player to accrue more and more wealth. When I say wealth, I don't just mean money, in-game or otherwise. When I say wealth, I mean this as a shorthand for any number of benefits that can be quantified and used to the benefit of the player. For example, players are often encouraged to get high scores, to find all the collectibles, to get their completion of level under a certain time, to get all of the upgrades, to get the highest amount of kills in a match or have the best kill-to-death ratio on the game's leaderboards. These are all forms of social capital, ways of making the player feel that they need to be doing more in the game in order to demonstrate that they are better than others. Competition is not fundamentally capitalist or neoliberal in nature, but competition that is framed in regards to quantifiable numbers that can be maximized, resources that can be collected, etc., reflect neoliberalism's ideologies of self-worth, social and moral character being defined by one's ability to perform the role of a capitalist in their life. By making everyone think like capitalists as they play, most games become methods of conditioning people, including children, to accept the terms of neoliberalism both in terms of capital and in terms of labor. Let's look at a game for example. This will be fun. Pokemon Snap. Pokemon Snap is a game in which you take pictures of Pokemon. If that was all the game was, then the game would be a great game to introduce to people not familiar with video games, because of how easygoing, cute, and simple it is. However, the game is actually a very bad game to introduce people to video games, for a simple reason. The game blockades you from progress unless you perform photography and find in-game secrets that require a certain level of skill in order to progress. Photography is a skill for sure, but photography is also expressive, artistic, and creative. By taking something that ought to be creative and blockading players until they generate good enough numbers to be deserving of progress, the game reflects neoliberal logic. The consequence is that, for those who are not good enough, they will never get past certain parts of the game. The game is, to a person who is already well familiar with games, very easy. But to someone who isn't, this could be the difference between if they get into video games or not. In other words, the barriers to entry for a lot of video games, even easy games made for children, force people to fit a certain standard of time and effort put in to develop skills in order to even be deserving of the option to enjoy a video game. Games are supposed to be art, but games reflect neoliberal values so much that they become hostile to anyone who doesn't think the way a laborer or a capitalist might. This is an example of a grand narrative promoted by games. The necessity of skill, blockades on content that require a certain degree of performance, and quantification of someone's value as they play a game via scores and in-game benefits are so commonplace in games that for a time, games that deliberately refuse these norms were brought into question as if they even count as games at all. But this norm was not an inevitable consequence of gaming. In fact, it was a very preventable norm. It's just that capitalism and profit motive played a huge role in designing games this way, such that you can almost immediately identify a game's ideological values by the mere presence of progress being marked by numbers going up in relation to skill, time, or dedication to a game. The Stanley Parable is part of the atmospheric exploration genre, derogatorily called walking simulators. The reason this name came about is because longtime gamers rejected these kinds of experiential games on a fundamental basis, that they are not games, just walking simulators. Their reasoning is that their understanding of what constitutes a game is competitive by nature. This is not true. Many games, not just video games but games that children play, board games, games that adults play, are not competitive. Many games are simply experiential, exploratory, or creative. For example, a children's role-playing game constitutes a game because there are a series of rules that those playing the game must follow, those rules being defined by what roles they are agreeing to take on. Entering into an arbitrary series of rules to perform actions that result in an outcome that does not carry meaning outside of the system is unambiguously one way of defining what a game is. And yet there are so many games that fit this definition that do not involve competition. Quote-unquote walking simulators fit this definition of a game. The hatred towards walking simulators is, in part, the fact that they appealed to women, that they told stories that were critical of gaming conventions, and also, in part, that they break with a lot of neoliberal presuppositions about how games ought to be designed. Win states, competition, self-improvement are all presuppositions a lot of gamers make about what constitutes a game. But here's the thing. Those presuppositions also have their inverse. If one fails to self-improve at a game communicates a message of hostility or indifference. If one does not win a game communicates a message of failure and loss. If one fails to compete, a game communicates a lesser status between yourself and those who do not fail to compete. This is the social contract that players enter into in order to play these kinds of games. This is why I don't play those kinds of games. Certainly, I do play games with win states and loss states, I sometimes play games with competitive elements, and I do play games with intent to improve my performance. But in all of these, the purity of experience gets lost, and so I rarely do play games in that way, and prefer games with a worthwhile story, interesting details in its world, or weird creative things that the game allows me to do. This is because I don't want to be swallowed up in the feeling that I'm not good enough, or that I need to perform at all times. I don't want games to be laborious to experience. The quote-unquote walking simulator games show an exact contrast to this, because the games are almost designed to be a one-and-done type of experience. You play the game, experience the emotions that the story has, take witness of the world and the joys of what the world can tell you, then when the game is over, you feel a sense of satisfaction and then you move on. You do not become glued to the game, beholden to the whims of its designers. You do not become an object to the game. The Stanley Parable is a game about how games convert you into an object to the game. In other words, games keep you in a perpetual, meaningless cycle of typing away at your keyboard and mashing away at your controller, so that eventually you'll get some satisfaction of a win, of having done it right, of having a success or an improvement or an accomplishment. but games are tailor-made to condition you to think that if you don't do these things, you aren't playing it right, and thus you need to keep playing forever and ever. Games encourage addiction. I've been planning to write about this in numerous videos. I believe that the ways in which games encourage addiction and condition people to think in terms of neoliberal self-objectification are major themes of a lot of the better games of the past decade or so. Hotline Miami comments on how games take the acts of fictional violence and convert them into labor, encouraging an addictive relationship to acts of violence that then psychologically harm action game audiences. Life is Strange comments on how games which take the completionist mindset of having to win and do everything right result in people becoming self-destructive and overly anxious, and condition people to think in terms of being able to manipulate outcomes in a manner that's completely divorced from how life and social relationships happen in the real world. The Beginner's Guide criticizes the mentality that games need to have a win state and a clear goal or outcome that the player is striving to achieve in order for the game to be of any value or meaning, and suggests alternatively that there is liberatory and therapeutic power in allowing games to simply be an expression of self and a free space to explore experiences and ponder their intrinsic value. The Stanley Parable mocks completionism as well. The game makes it so that no one ending is the true ending, and that getting every possible ending is immensely difficult, obtuse, time-consuming, and draining. The achievements that you can get on Steam for playing the game make fun of achievements as a cultural norm in games. There's also the test achievement, an achievement you literally cannot get, making 100% completionism impossible by a certain metric. The Divine Ending specifically mocks the notion of completionism by coercing the player into pressing the same button over and over again for hours in order to prevent a baby from dying. This ending is very similar to Desert Bus, a game I spoke about in my previous video. This baby game is a satirical take on how arbitrary the conditions of gaming even are. After all, this is difficult, it takes a long time to complete, and it has a story that can immediately broadcast a specific moral and emotional meaning to it, and yet it plainly and intentionally sucks. This is because playing games simply to win is not why anyone plays games ever. If that were the sole reason someone played games, they would be happy to play the baby game. There are more details, aesthetic, emotional, psychological, personal, that motivate one to play games. The Stanley Parable resists the urge in a lot of gamers to think of games as a means to an end of social capital. You don't benefit from getting all the endings, getting all the achievements, etc. You don't win anything. The game likely has speedruns, but speedruns would be unrewarding to watch or to attempt. The game is the antithesis to the norms of gaming that neoliberalism has pushed for decades now. But more specifically, the game draws a connection between the act of playing those kinds of games and labor. Stanley is a worker. Stanley's work is the Stanley Parable. This is evidenced by a screen at the title screen being the title screen itself in an infinite regression. Just as we type away on a keyboard when we do work, we type away at a keyboard when we play games. Physically, the act of playing games is remarkably similar to actual white-collar labor, and we are conditioned to act and think like laborers as we play games. The Stanley Parable mocks us by recreating a labor condition as a game and then asking us to break free from it. We are tasked with exiting an office, and yet nothing we do can actually do this. Instead, we are perpetually just a rat in a maze, back at the office again and again. And this reflects how games condition people to act as labor when we play, as in the case of Pokemon Snap or the myriad of competitive games that condition players to fixate on stats. When you stop playing games for the simple joy of play and start playing games hoping to accomplish a specific outcome that you can then use to gain social capital, you stop playing and start working. And the Stanley Parable is a game where play is work. The result of this connection drawn in the game is that games are existentially and psychologically oppressive because they keep you forever trapped in a cycle of agreeing to the terms of capitalist labor. You lose a sense of joy and become simply a worker, but in a virtual space. However, the Stanley Parable makes the point that gameplay in games broadly is mundane. In other words, Call of Duty is a routine, a laborious act of shooting faceless enemies over and over again. It may feel like a power fantasy, but the power fantasy subsides when it becomes a normal part of your life. It ceases to be exciting as an experience and begins being a simple routine, like brushing teeth or going to work. There's nothing more meaningful about getting to fire a weapon at people in Call of Duty versus not getting to fire a weapon at people in the Stanley Parable. In essence, the Stanley Parable collapses the distinction between Call of Duty and Power Wash Simulator because games are mundane by their very nature of existing as a routine that people do to pass time in their otherwise mundane lives. Stanley's existential threat is not just his desire to escape his workplace environment, but his desire to escape the mundane. He keeps seeking new outcomes, new worlds, new stories, anything other than the simple on-a-rail story that he seems to be trapped in. He reflects the player. Players in games desire to escape the mundane realities of our lives by seeking comfort in escapist fantasies of games, but these games are themselves the mundane reality of our lives. And the thing is, nothing Stanley can do to escape the mundane actually does so. This is true in video games as well. Nothing we do to escape via games will actually escape because the content in games is itself often a series of routines that result in meaningless outcomes. Davey Wreden spoke in an interview about how he is interested in a game where the complex experience players have is not mechanical, but psychological. He wanted to make a game where you take away something with you after playing. The Beginner's Guide is the culmination of that for me, being a game where I took away so much that it honestly made me want to be a better person and work on ways in which I had been toxic towards the people in my life. Games, as art, do have those kinds of transformative powers, but we have to break away from the psychological mindset that neoliberalism in the gaming industry often conditions players to be under, because that psychological mindset does not result in meaningful revelations or changes to your life. Instead, it keeps you hooked on games and keeps you in a mindset that is detrimental to your well-being. You lose all sense of self into a series of measurements of your worth that you do not get to decide on. You should determine your own self-worth and not based on what numbers you can maximize or what social image you can cultivate, because that is simply internalizing power structures that are designed to keep you feeling always not good enough. The Stanley Parable is an exploration of choice. What happens if you disobey a game? Well, in a game like the Stanley Parable, disobedience isn't possible. All the options that the player has are determined by the game so that when you feel as though you've meaningfully disobeyed, you find out that the game already expected that of you. The result is that the game is always one step ahead of you. You're always on its track. There are ways to really disobey games, via exploits and glitches and breaking the game in various ways, as well as via hacking and mods, but here's the thing. Those are methods of playing the game against its terms. As I've said before, you can't defeat a system by agreeing to its terms. You have to start to think outside of what you are expressly allowed to do if you want to defy a system meaningfully. And with games, defying the system means finding ways to both expose its flaws and exploit them. If we accept the logic of the narrative of the Stanley Parable, then Stanley's defiance begins the instant he does anything other than walk through the door on the left. If we focus instead on the gameplay, then neither Stanley nor the player can really do anything to defy the game. But the game makes points about this, that many things that appear to be defiance simply aren't. And if we look at the game as commenting on games in the industry, then we can make the case that even defiance of the in-game systems are not meaningfully defying the game. After all, if you mod Skyrim, you most likely bought Skyrim, which means that Bethesda got your money either way. If you agree to the terms of playing a game at all, you in some way validate the power that the company who made the game has. If the game is a big budget AAA title, then mega corporations win because you agreed to their terms. Playing the Stanley Parable and then taking the right door instead of the left is like boycotting a product but still continuing to buy it anyway. You feel defiant emotionally, but you didn't really do anything. And that sort of futility of defiance is a broader point the Stanley Parable makes. The games give you choice, so the consequences of your choice are not meaningful. Think about it this way. If you play a game like BioShock and you have the choice to save the little sisters or to kill them, what does this say about you? Literally nothing. Because the two options and their consequences were determined by BioShock's developers. And so if you make an immoral decision and the game just suggests that this is bad of you, it's not ever really bad of you, because you didn't do anything, your character did. Games, mechanically, are often indifferent to the player. The player is simply a witness to the events of the game and has no meaningful agency in them. To quote Wreden again, many games give you hundreds of inputs and yet you make no real contribution. Games that use spectacle to distract the player from the reality that they're really not doing anything at all. This is perhaps the biggest flaw with gaming that Wreden wanted to address in the Stanley Parable, that when you do things in a game, it rarely ever feels like you did it. A major reason why the game has a narrator who dictates to you everything to do is that you have to make the conscious connection in your head that defiance is an option and then choose it. A big part of the joy of the game is discovering what you can do that the game does not tell you to do. In essence, the game is about trying to break it. The result of a system where you do not get to determine the outcomes or the choices that would lead to those outcomes, as in the case of the two-door scenario, is that you do not feel as though you are a subject of this experience, but instead an object. The experience could go fully autonomously, and while there might be some emotional connection to experiencing it firsthand, you didn't get to select the conditions or outcomes, and so the encounter is never about you. An example to illustrate this point is a broader cultural fascination with the concept of walkable cutscenes. These give the illusion of meaningful interaction because in order for the story beats to occur, the player has to interact with the game space. But the reason why this frustrates players so much is that it sets a new trend in which story beats that were typically confined to skippable non-interactive cutscenes are now instead forced onto the player under the guise of being gameplay. Games are supposed to be the medium that allows for a deeper connection to the material because of increased immersion and increased agency. When you have hundreds of inputs and yet make no contribution, you are effectively on rails. Games become a roller coaster or a theme park ride. This is what makes the choices futile. Since the outcomes are predetermined and the choices granted to you, the impact of these choices on the player will be lessened because they don't feel as though they were seriously involved in why things turned out the way they did. The Stanley Parable both parodies this phenomenon and provides a counterpoint. You do feel as though you had involvement in the outcome because you're constantly finding ways to negate the narrative through various forms of critical thinking about what can be done to get off the rails that the game appears to have you on. At the same time, the game has an answer for every action you do take, where you discover that this too was intended by the developer. The point being that your detachment from the narrative is a flaw in game narratives and game mechanics themselves. Games require you to play on their terms, and when you try to play on your terms, you may find yourself often frustrated. Playing games on their terms can often result in interesting and fun experiences, but the limitations become apparent when exposed to the idea of defiance. The Stanley Parable has one ending in particular that mocks games. This is the ending where the narrator decides that you must just not want to play this game and plants you in another one. In the original release, the narrator plants you in Minecraft. In Ultra Deluxe, he plants you into Firewatch and Rocket League. These are all not substantially changed because you don't actually play these games. You're still Stanley, stuck with Stanley's mechanics. There's not much you can do. But really, there's not much you can do in these games either. Granted, they're all very different games from one another and all have very different meanings. But the problem is it could be any game and the point is still made. Games subject you to the whims of their designers, and while that is necessary for games to even be made at all, the consequence is that most games are of equal value to one another for two reasons. The first is that most designers have remarkably similar ambitions and intentions behind what experience they want you to have. Minecraft is a sandbox game, and there are many, many sandbox games that have the same goals they set out for their players to accomplish. Rocket League is a competitive sport game, and there are thousands of games with competitive angles that are identical to Rocket League's. Firewatch is a story game and is most similar to the Stanley Parable in this regard, and story games all tend to have fairly similar points to them with regards to how their mechanics play out to tell a narrative. The second is that most designers are trying to succeed, trying to appeal to as many people as possible, which means that truly unique intentions of design are less likely to A, sell well, and B, be easily accessible to players to even be heard of, let alone experienced. Let me use a specific counterexample. There's a short Unity game called Slave of God. Slave of God is one of my favorite games I've ever played. In it, you walk into a nightclub and engage in various unanticipated, destructive, and antisocial activities. It's really short, it's really simple, and it's told from a first-person perspective. However, when you actually play the game, you'll find that, aesthetically speaking, the game is a total nightmare to play. Slave of God is meant to mimic the experience of being absolutely messed up on drugs. I don't know exactly what drugs the game is commenting on, but the general experience of the game is a sort of abstract reenactment of the Smack My Bitch Up music video, and it at times more closely resembles the film Enter the Void than it does any video game. Slave of God is truly unique, at least to me. It's free to download, so it's not apparently motivated by financial success. It's not well known, so it's not apparently motivated by social capital. It is simply a game the developer made because he wanted to make it. It resists a lot of the norms of gaming that make game development have extrinsic motivations that result in the same mindset as other game developers. To contrast this, the beginner's guide showcases the games of a developer named Coda who doesn't exist. I recall at least one critic somewhere saying that they think Coda may have been inspired by the developer of Slave of God, Stephen Lavelle, also known as Ink Repair. Ink Repair games are some of my favorite games ever, and the beginner's guide immediately struck me as similarities, because Coda's games did not seem to have any extrinsic motivation. They were designed simply because Coda had an idea he wanted to explore in a game. The Beginner's Guide is a game, in part, about the joys of creation simply for its own sake, and how artistic freedom and truly unique and exciting mechanical and narrative ideas in games are stifled or even bastardized by financial incentive and traditional norms of design. Davey Wreden was a critical studies student, which means in part that he is interested in critical gaming. The Stanley Parable is clearly an example of this, and its criticism of mainstream games, even including games in a similar genre to itself such as Firewatch, suggests to me that there is something to be said about how games of any kind, when becoming extrinsically motivated by intended audience, financial success, or even just notoriety, collapse the distinction between each other and become ultimately mundane and not particularly valuable. I don't think that Davey is even criticizing any of the games that this ending makes jokes about. I think if anything, he's actually praising them, suggesting that these are the games people would rather play. In the case of Minecraft, it's better than the Stanley Parable because it allows more creative freedom for the player. In the case of Firewatch, it's better than the Stanley Parable because it tells a more emotionally resonant, relatable, and real-world story. In the case of Rocket League, it's better because it allows for more catharsis through competition and more joy of play. But all of these games, ultimately, are simply success stories of an industry that has many, many more failures. And most of those failures were attempting to do the same thing as these games. And many of them did those same things very well. But capitalism is forever an extrinsic motivation that puts pressure on developers to make the next Minecraft, Firewatch, Rocket League, to make the next Half-Life or Portal, or yes, even Stanley Parable. It's interesting then that there was no sequel to the Stanley Parable, that instead Davey followed it up with a short, highly personal game with the beginner's guide, and then re-released the Stanley Parable as Ultra Deluxe. And of course, for people who've played Ultra Deluxe, they found out that he snuck the sequel to the game in the re-release as an additional meta joke. So then, let's talk about the Stanley Parable 2.
Which is why I'm very proud to announce for the first time ever, the Stanley Parable 2.
The Stanley Parable was a fairly big success for an indie developer with no prior experience. It would be natural to want to follow the game up, to capitalize on the success of the first game while it was still relevant. Releasing a sequel the very next year that offers tons of new endings with new witty commentaries, or that offers new methods of defiance and new strange ways of messing with the game, would have been all too tempting. And instead, the Stanley Parable 2 was released 9 years later and snuck into a re-release of the first game called the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe. Why even do this? Why do it this way? I don't have a confident answer, but I do think that one possible motivating factor was to avoid an awkward marketing situation where the new content would be given extra weight and expectations by being viewed as a standalone game and as a unique follow-up to the previous game. As well, as far as the meta themes and existentialism go, the decision to have the new content be snuck into the game as almost a whole separate game contained within the first would also allow for the game to explore the futility of making a sequel at all. In fact, a lot of the new content, rather than allowing variations of strange outcomes for Stanley to end up in, instead focuses on the Stanley Parable as a cultural touchstone in indie gaming, reflecting on its reception, criticism, interpretations of the game, and also Davey's own relationship to the first game and its success. In this regard, Ultra Deluxe actually resembles the beginner's guide more than the first game did. It feels simultaneously more meta and more introspective. It reflects Davey's desire both in creating the game and in reaction to its reception, to make something that really resonates with people. Interestingly, while the original game feels like Stanley takes on a bit of the perspective of Davey, in Ultra Deluxe it feels a bit more like the narrator takes on the perspective of Davey. The Stanley Parable 2, then, is both a self-mockery and a bit of a chance to reflect on the personal impact of success in the gaming industry. The major running gag of Ultra Deluxe is that all of the new content is deliberately pointless and excessive. Ultra Deluxe parodies a number of trends of contemporary gaming culture. Ultra Deluxe has a more linear progression than the first game. What's interesting about this linear progression is that it seems to follow a sort of hypothetical progression as to the creative process behind the decision to make Ultra Deluxe. In other words, as the new content develops, we sort of see the process of what Wreden might have been going through in trying to follow up the Stanley Parable. It begins with an announcement of the new Ultra Deluxe content. The first thing we get of quote-unquote new content is something called the Jump Circle, where you can jump a total of 36 times. This is obviously making a joke about the lack of a jumping feature in the original game, which I imagine is mocking player complaints about the Stanley Parable and other quote-unquote walking simulators, lacking basic first-person shooter features like the ability to jump. As well, when you think about the early stages of the creative process for following up a big creative project such as a video game, a lot of the early ideas will just be brainstorming new features and twists on what you already did. Like, what can we do differently? And when you experience a sort of writer's block of creativity, you end up with really dull ideas like, what if we added a jump button? This sort of creative rut is being parodied here by suggesting that the only new idea Davey could think to add to the game was a jump, and then putting the player into an absurd version of the execution of that change. Then, Stanley is shown a place that the narrator made called the Memory Zone. This place is an ironic glorification of the original game where it exaggerates the importance of the Stanley Parable as a gaming experience. These little jokes are not just the game poking fun at itself, it's Wreden poking fun at his own relationship to the game he made. It makes sense to me not just as a follow-up to the original game, but to the beginner's guide as well, showcasing similar themes of imposter syndrome and an uncertain sense of one's own legacy. It should go without saying that the Stanley Parable, despite being a very interesting game, isn't exactly a world-changing work of art. It was one indie game that got a lot of attention about a decade ago. For players, the Stanley Parable is just a game they played and maybe liked. For Wreden, it was the thing that launched his career as a game writer and as a professional creative. So I see this stuff as parodying the weight that the game has taken on in his own life, while also making fun of the self-importance that the game attributes to itself by being so postmodern and meta. Also, I think that to an extent, this section is an easy chance to inject the game with some really dry and goofy humor. Effectively, what the memory zone evokes is the sort of honeymoon phase of early indie success, where Wreden's own relationship to the Stanley Parable was initially really positive when it started to do well and achieve recognition, because it inflated his sense of self-importance. Following the same sort of introspective bent as the beginner's guide, the narrator begins looking at positive reviews of the Stanley Parable to remind Stanley of the good times. Then the narrator begins having a bit of a crisis as they access Steam reviews and see a lot of the complaints people had about the game. This entire section is pretty apparently a reflection of Wreden's Game of the Year blog post, or at least the emotional roller coaster of releasing the Stanley Parable that inspired him to write that post. That post reflects a lot of the sentiments that emerged in the beginner's guide, but whereas the beginner's guide reflects this sense of an existential crisis and serious self-esteem issues, the Stanley Parable takes a more self-deprecating route in a way that suggests that those issues that Wreden had made somewhat public on his blog have, hopefully, subsided and he can be healthily laughed about. Specifically, the implication of the Steam review section of the game is an inner desire on the part of the dev to try to please everyone, to try to make a game that everyone loves. As someone who very much did not like the Stanley Parable on release, I completely understand this impulse, but can also say that games are at their best when they are not trying to appeal to everyone. Instead, the best games, in my opinion, tend to be the games that appeal to the developers first and foremost, because if you're a fan of your own game, then you're going to be making the best version of that game for people who would be fans of it. Ultra Deluxe, in a lot of ways, is to me an improvement on the original version of the game because of the fact that it's made with a lot more confidence about its perspective. It also just weirdly feels a bit more accessible and personal, in a way that helps me connect to it more. This section of the game leads to a Steam review where the reviewer said that they wish there was a skip button on the long-winded talking of the narrator. The game then offers the player a skip button and begins a long, sort of dark story in which the skip button causes Stanley to skip forwards in exponentially increasing lengths of time, where the narrator becomes stuck by himself for minutes, then hours, then days, then weeks, then years. At first, this is just a long-winded joke about how some people found the narrator really annoying, but then the game gets to one rant that is worth singling out.
But they didn't understand the game was never meant to be funny. It was meant to have a point. It was meant to speak to the human condition.
This was the quote that prompted me to rethink my view of the game initially and why I eventually decided to make this video, because this is in the middle of a rant that ends up looping back on itself and allows you to see what perspective the narrator is coming from. Basically, the narrator says that people demand art function purely as escapism, and the audience's hesitance to experience any emotion other than fun is born out of a constant need to have their demands as consumers met, and also out of a fear of looking inward and finding issues within themselves that they seek to avoid through media that makes them feel good. Despite the fact that this rant is meant as a joke in which the narrator has become absolutely deliriously angry due to the lengths of alone time he gets to spend ruminating on what people didn't like about the game, it also functions as a serious commentary on the game industry and on the general issues of the neoliberal state of media. See, games can be art, but in order to continue to make art, you need to spend money, and often you're going to want to make money as well. Part of the ideology of neoliberalism is the conversion of the self into capital. This involves commodifying all of your creative ventures, no matter how personal or impersonal, so that they can maximize profits. This entire section of the game suggests a sort of conflict in Wreden's approach to designing a game like the Stanley Parable in the first place. I'm sure when he designed the game originally, he designed it mostly based on what he thought would make for the best experience. However, early in interviews and intrinsic to the game itself is a sense that the game is very much about the reaction of audiences. Wreden wanted a game that would provoke discussions outside of the game, and the Stanley Parable by its nature is designed around exploring how players will perceive the game. The result is that there is an element of self-consciousness to the game innately. While the original game was maybe less self-conscious than Ultra Deluxe, both games ultimately have a tightrope that they have to walk between wanting to make something personal that the developer will think is good, versus something that will have the broadest appeal. You can't ever have both things to the fullest extent that you might want. Even Minecraft, the best-selling game of all time, doesn't appeal to a large chunk of people interested in video games. So when it comes to an indie game reliant on meta humor, mocking gamer culture, and appealing to people not on the basis of fun, but on the basis of meaning, the Stanley Parable was very unlikely to have that sort of maximized appeal to begin with. But at the same time, if Wreden approached it with no regard to how players would perceive it, the game wouldn't really be possible to make because it is a game about player reaction. So there's a tension between the neoliberal conditioning of trying to maximize the self by making the numbers go as high as you can, versus the artistic self trying to be honest to what art the artist wants to make. This is true of all art under neoliberalism, but it's especially true of video games and very much the case with the Stanley Parable. There's financial incentive to simply give the players what they want, but that would defeat the entire point of the Stanley Parable, because it's a game that is deliberately in tension between player choice and narrative outcomes. This theme of giving the people what they want is the entire structure of Ultra Deluxe, but rather than doing so sincerely, it does so largely ironically, by quote-unquote fixing all of the issues of the original game and highlighting how self-defeating that is by its nature. The skip button section, and particularly that one rant from the narrator, reflects a potential part of Davey who reacted with anger when confronted with people saying his game wasn't very funny. See, here's the thing. The narrator says that the game wasn't supposed to be funny. I didn't like the game at first because I didn't find it funny. And yet, even though the game is supposed to make a point, the game is also supposed to be funny at times. So there's a sort of denial in what the narrator is saying, where he's lashing out at people critical of the game because he's insecure about the fact that he didn't make a game that appealed to them. By building up his own ego in response to the tearing down of his ego by the consumer market, he reveals a certain anger and contrarianism to the idea of making a game for people. You try to make a game people like, and then when people don't like it, you almost view the idea of making a follow-up game pointless because people are just going to skip it anyway. After the skip button, the narrator introduces the Stanley Parable 2. This section seems to reflect the creative process after the idea of just giving up on following up the Stanley Parable, where Davey, or any typical game developer, might come around instead to leaning all in on cashing in for the sake of brand recognition and making a sequel to a beloved property. This reflects the point where Davey thought that if he were to follow up the original Stanley Parable, it should be a full-blown sequel that expands greatly on the original. But then, how do you even do that? There's really not much you can do. And so this section is loaded with a bunch of jokes reflecting the futility of cash grab sequels, because the big idea of a big sequel is really the only thing you can do to make it sound like an important follow-up to the first game. But while games like Half-Life 2 exist, you will rarely ever see a sequel like Half-Life 2. Instead, you'll see a million amped 2s. This section of the game opens with a lot of jabs at the corporate tech culture that the video game industry is tightly wrapped up in. We see an investor showcase that makes it appear like a tech conference. We see a bunch of art and boardroom contents that suggest a team of people working tirelessly to produce the hot new product of the Stanley Parable 2, and all they've come up with is slapping the number 2 onto the original game. This is mocking the relentless pressure to capitalize on success by giving people the same thing again but incrementing the number. It's the same game as before, nothing is different, except now it has shiny new colors and sleek new fonts. It's the neoliberal conception of how to make art. Literal committee thinking producing an image of artistry that will generate the most industry support because of its supposed broad demographic appeal, while fundamentally misunderstanding why the first game was a hit in the first place. As well, as part of a very small indie development team, Wreden was a bit of an outsider to the industry when he made the first game. I'm sure that after the Stanley Parable was released, he may have started to see a lot of inside industry experiences that might have wanted to drag him into becoming part of the larger corporate machine. And because of this, I see a sense of mocking the Stanley Parable's reception in this, where it feels like Wreden is making a point about how the corporate culture that wanted to make money off of indie darlings such as the Stanley Parable just don't understand anything about it. Not to mention it reflects a potential inner desire to sell out at a moment when everyone's eyes are on him for having become an indie darling. The Stanley Parable itself was a mockery of corporate culture, so the idea that a very corporate gaming industry could seek interest in the game or anyone involved in making it is ironic and silly. The Stanley Parable is basically an anti-game, so any attempt to try to assimilate it into the broader scheme of making large sums of money is going to be difficult because nothing about the Stanley Parable can appeal to people as a brand. It can only appeal to people based on its artistic intentions. The Stanley Parable 2 features a bunch of boardroom gags mocking industry committee think, such as a whiteboard that says 1. More TSP, 2. Better TSP. Typically, a lot of corporate thinking involves these sorts of white-collar paradigm shift rhetoric that are ultimately just meaningless fluff to excite and motivate white-collar workers. This kind of corporate culture has been satirized since at least the 90s with movies like Fight Club, American Psycho, and Office Space. But what I appreciate about this part of Ultra Deluxe in particular is that the original Stanley Parable used a lot of office interior images to satirize corporate culture before. The Stanley Parable is very meta in its writing, not just in its narration, but in the writing and the details of the world like PowerPoint presentations, etc. Part of the point of being meta in the original Stanley Parable with the office culture stuff was to mock how meaningless and faux warm but secretly hostile office culture really is, by presenting things like graphs that don't make sense but have this bizarre sense of self-importance to inflate the egos of the people who are making them. It's very much making fun of the numbers go up mentality of the tech industry. The Stanley Parable 2 brings this back around by having an office culture surround the original game, treating it as a product the same as the product that we can imagine Stanley's company was paid to push. In these offices, the cold, meaningless language around the Stanley Parable as a hot product shows the supposed corporation that is trying to make the Stanley Parable 2 happen completely fail to understand the original game. In other words, Ultra Deluxe satirizes how people working for tech industry corporations have disappeared so far up the ass of white-collar capitalism that they think that fundamentally meaningless and stupid quote-unquote paradigm shifts are actually really meaningful. In other words, if you can place the Stanley Parable in the place where boardroom rhetoric forms around a marketing goldmine, then the rhetoric is just masturbatory nonsense, because the Stanley Parable itself is masturbatory nonsense.